So when we try to talk about weight control in our horses, we get so confused. We are wondering how we can get our overweight horse to be leaner. And we know that if we starve it, uh, it'll lose body fat. I mean, that's a no-brainer, right? But nobody wants to starve the horse because that's cruel and unusual punishment. So we have to understand that fat is just the accumulation of excess glucose. So the extra sugar that the horse eats has to be placed someplace. And the, the subject I want to go over is not so much the intake, because that's the diet. And we've gone over the diet a lot. But I think what's missing in a lot of people's understanding of weight loss is the other end, the metabolism, and how we can make it more efficient. And once you get this under control, the metabolism under control, and then you couple it with the diet, then your horse isn't going to be hungry anymore. He's going to feel satiated. He's not going to be pounding the stall door demanding its food. He's not going to be ripping your arms out of your sockets as you head out to the field because he's so hungry. You're going to learn how to control this. So that's the subject of this week's podcast of The Horse's Advocate. This is Doc T, and thank you for tuning in. If this podcast makes sense, please just forward it to your friends. The more people hear it, the better off we are. Not an agenda-driven company. I don't have anything to sell. I just want you to get information to understand this whole process of energy flux, which is the flow of energy from food through the body and then it's expelled. So I've done this before. And if you haven't heard it, that's great. You're here, you're going to hear it now. If you've heard it before, maybe I'm going to say it in a way that makes more sense. It can't be said enough. But energy flux is everything. And every plant and every animal, that includes the fish and the birds, everything you see out there has energy flux. In other words, horses have a structure that we recognize as a horse. The hair, the hooves, the tail, the eyes, everything that says you've got a horse in front of you has to maintain a certain amount of energy to keep that thing alive. And if it doesn't have enough energy coming in, the functions of the animal will just cease. And then over time, they will just blow away as dust. There'll be nothing left. That's called entropy. Entropy just means that everything wants to get back to its lowest energy state, which is nothing more than a molecule. And to create the shape that you see in front of you requires energy. And that requires us to eat. And the horse is an obligate vegetarian. So the horse basically is grazing on grasses, and they bring those grasses into the mouth, and that's their raw material. And that raw material is food, and food is stored energy. And the digester process is going to convert that food into a fuel. And then that fuel is going to go to the cell, and the cell is going to take that fuel and turn it into energy that creates a sparks that keeps the animal alive. It's very similar to crude oil being pumped out of the ground. It has to go through a refinery to make a fuel. That's the digestion of crude oil that becomes a fuel that can go into your car. But the fuel isn't going to push your car down the road. It's the burning of that fuel, or the metabolism, if you will, that takes that gasoline or diesel or propane or whatever you've got in there, and it combusts it into energy. And it does that by applying a little bit more energy, called a spark or pressure, that heats it up and makes it explode. And that energy is used to turn the crankshaft that turns the wheels and gets you going down the road. Now, I'm not here to make you guys auto mechanics, so don't worry about it. But everybody knows about cars or trucks or vehicles, and that you got to put fuel in it. Food comes in, it goes into the digestive tract, it's converted into fuels, which are basically carbohydrates and fats, fatty acids. And those are put into the cell, and that goes into a special part of the cell, the mitochondria, and that creates the energy that is stored in their electron transport chain, which is like the battery. And then it's used to spark and make reactions occur that keeps that cell alive. And every cell does this, and collectively your body stays alive. We know about not feeding grain because grain is high in sugars and has other inflammatory ingredients. So you shouldn't be feeding any grain, especially grain byproducts that are in your balancers and all those hay extenders. They have basically waste products from the human food industry that's going into our horses. So you want to avoid that because that's inflammatory. So you're left with pasture and hay. And pasture and hay basically gives structural, non-structural carbohydrates, which is confusing because the non-structural are basically starch, which is digested by the horse into sugar. And then you have the structural carbohydrates, which is cellulose, which is digested by the horse into fat. So the horse is getting both carbohydrates and fat coming in from the hay and the pasture that it eats. As far as protein goes, that's a whole different subject. And we all should be feeding protein first, not last, not as an afterthought, but you should be feeding protein first and then topping everything off with pasture and hay. But that's a whole different podcast. Let's just talk about this flow of fuels that come into the horse by eating and then digestion. And then those fuels are transported through the body into the cell, mostly the muscle cell, but all cells. And in that cell, it's that glucose or the fatty acid is metabolized into energy and we stay alive. Where we have a lot of problems in horses is we don't understand that metabolism side. We know about equine metabolic syndrome. We say it all the time. We say about the metabolism being bad. We talk about medications that we can use to decrease the stress on that. But nobody talks about how we can get the metabolism working better. And there's two ways to do that as a horse owner. The first way is to create some sort of exercise that forces the cells to consume the sugar that's in there, that's stored in there, to allow more fat to come into the cell. So this is confusing. So I'm going to back up and I'm going to go over this again. The cell wall prevents things from just flowing in and flowing out. It makes a container. And fat can actually flow in up to a point, and then there's no more room in the cell to absorb that fat. This fat is stored in little bubbles and is released as a single fatty acid. So it comes in as a triglyceride, which is 3 fatty acids bound to a nucleus in a structure called triglycerides. And maybe you've heard about your triglycerides. It's one of the measurements we look at. And one of those fatty acids breaks off and goes into the cell, and it leaves 2 fatty acids attached, and that's called a diglyceride. And it's now been shown that as you accumulate diglycerides inside the cell, it can actually signal the cell wall to stop absorbing any sugar. In other words, it's the cause of insulin resistance, which is fascinating, I think, because glucose is coming in from the diet and it comes to the cell wall bound to insulin. Glucose alone, not attached to insulin, free floating in the blood, is very toxic. Everything the glucose touches will cause damage. It is the leading cause of cardiovascular disease in humans, and it is the #1 killer of humans in the world right now, cardiovascular disease. So sugar's got to be escorted by insulin. And when that insulin brings the glucose to the cell wall, it is transported across in a specialized transport mechanism that protects the cell from damage from glucose. And it's either shoved into the closet, if you will, what's called glycogen, where it can be safely stored for future use, immediate use. So if the horse gets, scared and has to run, it's going to take that glycogen and break it down into glucose, and that's going to be turned to lactate, and boom, it goes into this mitochondria, and presto, you've got all the energy you need. But if the glycogen storage is full, then every molecule of glucose that comes down the pipe from diet is going to be immediately converted into lactate and shoved into the Krebs cycle. And as long as there's lactate creating acetyl-CoA in the Krebs cycle, fat cannot be used. It's just one of the rules of the game. So as long as sugar is coming in, it's going to prevent fat from being used. And that creates 2 problems. Problem number 1 is that the cell is no longer going to take in fat because there's no more room. So no fat is going to be released. And that's caused by, one, there's no demand for fat by the cells. And two, as long as insulin's around, insulin prevents the formation of free fatty acids that are free to come out as triglycerides. In other words, insulin keeps the fat accumulating in the body fat. So the more sugar you eat, the more fat is stored in the fat cells and it's not allowed to come out. And the excess glucose that's being resisted at the cell has to be put in the body fat. This is really important. Glucose is toxic to all animals. It's so toxic that if you take a human my size and you drain all the blood out and you look at just how much glucose is free, not bound to insulin, you're going to find that in my bucket of blood, you'll find 1 teaspoon total in my whole body that's free. And that glucose actually is going up to the brain and being used there in insulin independent uptake of glucose. If I were a diabetic and my blood glucose is high, I've got a monitor on me, it measures I've got high blood glucose at 125 milligrams per deciliter or more, then my total free sugar in my blood is only 1 1/3 teaspoons. So the difference between a normal, healthy 200-pound person and a diabetic is 1/3 of a teaspoon, which if you're in the metric is what, 2 mLs? It's nothing. That's how toxic it is. It must be bound to insulin. And if it's not bound to insulin, it's going to be in the form of glycogen in the cell, in the muscle cell, or in the liver. That's how they store glycogen or glucose there. Or it's converted into body fat and stored as body fat. So you have excess body fat. It's because of 2 things. 1, you're eating too much glucose, or 2, your body's not efficient enough. So let's go back to the cell, and all this excess glucose is coming in, and it keeps coming to the cell and flooding it. And they're pouring it in and it fills up all the glycogen. And you get on the treadmill and you start, I'm talking about a human now, but even horses, you do that workout where they're out there, in your ring doing their work. They're consuming the glucose that's coming in that you fed them, but they're not really getting into the glycogen stores. So as soon as the glucose levels are drawn down from the exercise, the problem is there's still more glucose there. They never get to the point where they have not enough glucose in the cell, which forces the cell to go over to the triglycerides that are stored in there to use them in the Krebs cycle. Remember, glucose becomes lactate, lactate becomes acetyl-CoA. That acetyl-CoA derived from lactate will prevent acetyl-CoA being formed from fat. So that fat stays in the cell and starts to accumulate. When that happens, no fat's going to come from the body fat, and you're not going to get reduced body fat. In fact, you're going to get increased body fat. And so you're working your horse, and you work them hard, or so you say you work them hard, but they're really not working at a high intensity where they're going to the point of exhaustion. I've yet to see any horse in my practice that has worked to exhaustion. And what I mean by exhaustion is I'm not talking about black beauty, beaten in the streets. No, that's not what I mean by exhaustion. What I mean is where you work to a point where your muscles fatigue. When the muscles fatigue, that means they've run out of lactate. That means they're in their glycogen store and they're using the glycogen storage. Once the glycogen storage goes down and lactate is reduced, that allows the fat to be utilized into creating energy. Now, in starvation, where there's no more sugar coming in, that's a no-brainer. We all can see that. We're going to use our body fat. We start to lose body fat because we're being starved. So we get that. But we're not starving our horses. But we are overfeeding them, and we're not working them hard enough. So I'm not your trainer. I can't tell you how to make your horse move more. But I know that if your horse is in a stall all the time, it doesn't get a chance to run out there with other horses and do that gallop like, a 2-year-old through there because they got arthritis or they're lame or they just stand out there swishing at flies. I get it. In humans, it turns out that we only need about 3 15-minute episodes of high intensity work every 7 days. So that's like 15 minutes on Monday, 15 on Wednesday, 15 on Friday, and you have the weekend off. And it's not treadmill work, but you have to get the heart rate up really high. And I'm not an expert, so don't ask me, and I don't know about horses. But if you don't get the muscles burning up that fuel, you'll never get the use of the fat inside the cell to be used, and therefore you'll never have a demand of taking fat off the body. So that's the metabolism restriction, or the hump we've got to get over. If you're dieting your horse and it's not working, it's because the metabolism needs to be increased. Now, again, if your horse is lame, I get it. It's, stall bound, it's old, it's never going to have that high intensity work. Well, that's going to be a tough thing, because then you've got this blockage here. Then you must be decreasing the amount of sugar that they're getting in. And usually when you do that and they do start losing body fat, and you can do that. I mean, wouldn't you and I stick to a diet if we were stuck in a stall and we didn't have a kitchen? I mean, yeah, then we'd lose body fat as well, but we'd be so hungry. But if we exercise and use lactate up, one of the neat gimmicks of that is it suppresses the appetite for 3 to 4 hours. So with that suppressed appetite, your muscles are taking all the body fat and they're just dumping it out of the cell, just keeping everything alive. And then as we start to get hungry, then we start to eat some other food. And in the horse's case, we start to feed them a little bit of hay, maybe 3, 4, 5 hours after they've had this high intensity work. And then that will come in and start to restore the glycogen. And then you give them a whole day off. And then the next day, you just make them work hard. And lunging around in a circle is not working. And putting them on a hot walker is not working. Movement, there's no doubt. We've been hearing this all the time. Get out and move. That's better than nothing. There's no doubt. That's better than nothing. But we have to get that metabolism going. We have to convert that engine over to using fat for fuel. And that's one way we can do it. So if your horse is a competitive horse, and I know a lot of you out there like cutting horses that work a long time, I mean, really working horses, endurance horses, there are other sports where horses are used, race horse, for example, they're working to the point where they're exhausted. That's great. And they're young. And so this podcast isn't going to touch a lot of people, but I wanted you to understand that metabolism is one of the points. And if you have an older horse or middle-aged horse, and all you do is go on gentle trail rides, or if you work in a ring and they work a sweat up, but they're not going to the point of muscle exhaustion, then they're never going to metabolize that. And the problem is, we think because they're working hard, we need to feed them more, but we shouldn't. We should work them hard and then use our eye and say, okay, are these horses fit? Do they have too much body fat? If so, then we have to adjust what's coming in and keep the exercise up. If you're exercising them and they start to lose their body fat and you feel like you need to top off the tank, by all means, add some more food. Every athlete knows that the amount of calories that goes in for an athlete is a lot higher than a sedentary horse. But you have to understand that you have to get this. And I don't have a program, to tell you the truth, because every horse is different and every farm's different. Everybody, has different things. But if in a human, it's just 15 minutes, 3 times a week, I think you as a horse owner might be able to find a way that you can get at least a 15-minute exercise program for your horse 3 times a week, even in your busy schedule. It may be helpful, especially if your horse has metabolic syndrome, or is it laminitic? Is it lame, but has excess body fat? If you could just put that extra work in there, and by the way, if you do it right, maybe you're the one out there running your horse up and down, and you're going to get the exercise too. I don't know. But energy flow or energy flux, it's the same thing, is the conversion of energy from food through digestion into fuels, and then going into the engine and being combusted into energy that's utilized to keep the animal alive. And that occurs for your horse, for you, for your dog and cat, for your snakes, your gerbils, your parakeet, everything, you name it, your fish in your fish tank, all the animals that you know of. have this cycle. And the horses in the wild that are truly in the wild, they've balanced this so they don't become obese, except maybe in the summer heading into winter. Then after winter, they don't have that intake, but they get their metabolism going. And hopefully this helps you understand the flow of energy from input to output. And you don't lose it in the poop or the pee. If you're using the SGL2 inhibitors, they're ergotaflozins or the flozins, they're dumping glucose out in the urine. That's going to help horses lose some excess glucose. That's why it's working in humans. They're now using it in horses. The GLP-1 inhibitors that are so popular in humans don't work that way. They work in a completely different fashion. And I don't know if they're using that in horses effectively. I would think that diet and exercise is a lot better. So hopefully that's helped you. And that's all I got to say. So hopefully I'll see you next time. And visit the Horses Advocate. We're putting down a new platform soon. And I can't wait because it's going to be so powerful. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Hey, everyone. Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's two reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.